We've just had a federal election which followed the longest campaign in modern history. Even though a lot of us don't vote, it's not that hard to do. But such wasn't always the case, particularly south of the border, where this year they're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And joining us now to discuss the significance of this landmark piece of legislation, Paul Finkelman. He is the Ariel F. Sallows Visiting Professor of Human Rights Law at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law, and we are happy to welcome you back to our studio.
It's a delight to be here, always.
Nice to have you here, Paul. Okay, put us into the time. It's 50 years ago. Lyndon Johnson is the president. What's happening as it relates to voting that makes him ultimately decide that a Voting Rights Act is necessary?
Well, first of all, the previous year they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so all of the signage, colored waiting room, white restroom, all that is gone. Restaurants are beginning to be integrated, hotels are. But what Johnson fully understands is that none of this is going to matter if blacks don't get political power. And voting in the United States is entirely regulated by the states. There are a couple of constitutional amendments, like the 15th, which says you can't discriminate on the basis of race, but it doesn't tell anybody how you actually have to run the elections. And so as long as Southern white voter registration people run the election, as long as the election officials are all Southern whites, blacks aren't going to vote. And as late as the time of the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act, 60% of blacks in the United States still live in the former slave states.
And therefore we're basically disenfranchised.
To give you one example, there are, at this time, 6 congressmen who are black, all of them from the North, even though 60% of the blacks live in the South. And in some states, blacks make up 40% of the population. Nobody in Congress, nobody in the state legislature, no black mayors. There are the rare black policemen in some big cities. That's it.
And of course, there are no black politicians because there are essentially no black people who can vote for black politicians.
In a few places like Atlanta and Houston, there is some black voting in some very large cities, but they have to be very large cities.
Okay, tell us about this expression, because I gather from 1888 to 1908, Southern states legalized disenfranchisement by enacting so-called Jim Crow laws. When we hear that expression, Jim Crow laws, what does that mean?
Jim Crow is the phrase that means segregation. So Jim Crow laws are the laws that segregate trains and schools and hospitals, and indeed anything you can imagine, including in the South, the state school for the blind. In case somebody miraculously learns to see, they won't suddenly find out that there's a black in their school. And everything is segregated by this time in the South. And with segregation comes disfranchisement. Disfranchisement comes in a variety of ways, all designed to reduce voting. To give you one quick example, in 1880, it is estimated that 77% of the eligible black men in South Carolina voted. By 1910, it's less than 2%.
Okay. And Selma, the movie.
Yeah.
Never mind the event, but the movie that was nominated for Academy Award for Best Picture came out last year. And I want to show a little clip here of a scene. This is Oprah Winfrey playing a character who's trying to vote. And you know, we'll talk about how typical this was, the kinds of conditions she ran into. So let's roll that.
Okay.
Please.
How many county judges in Alabama?
67.
Name them.
So that's how it worked, eh?
Yeah, it works like that. There are tests that they give. They give literacy tests. They give tests which ask you numerous questions. Many of the tests are multiple choice tests in which there is no right answer for some of the questions. So no matter what answer you put down, the registrar legally says, no, that's not a correct answer.
And this was a test presumably only given to potential black voters, never white voters.
Well, the state constitutions, most of them are fairly shrewd about not saying we only give the test to black people. The constitutions almost always have some clause saying that you must pass the literacy test or prove your knowledge of, and then it's very interesting, they always say knowledge of reading and writing the state constitution. So presumably they could say, please write out Article 1, Section 2 of the Alabama Constitution. But they always have an escape clause. At the discretion of the registrar, these things can be waived.
And the registrar was always white.
Always white, always a white Democrat. And when this doesn't work, especially in the 1880s and 1890s when there's still a substantial number of black voters, there's always intimidation, there's always armed fear. In a number of elections in South Carolina, white men would ride into town armed to the teeth. Many times they rode wearing red shirts. They were known as the red shirts. And the red shirts would ride into town on horses and just patrol the town with their rifles in their hands. And blacks would know we better not vote.
During this period, the Supreme Court of the United States generally upheld efforts to discriminate against racial minorities. How did the courts justify those decisions?
Well, the court justifies it by saying that the Constitution provides that each state shall provide equality. So no person shall be denied the equal protection of the law, is what the 14th Amendment says. But the court said, if you have two railroad cars, one for blacks and one for whites, you have equal protection of the law. They're equally allowed to get on their railroad
Separate
car.
but equal.
Separate but equal.
That was the...
And so they developed separate but equal. In voting, it's a little different, because when the states go overboard, the Supreme Court does occasionally enforce the 15th Amendment, which says there can be no discrimination in voting. Very quick example. Immediately after it becomes a state, Oklahoma passes a constitutional amendment to require a very strict and tough literacy test for all voters unless they or their male ancestor could have voted on January 1st, 1866. And of course, no blacks in anywhere but a few states in the North can vote on January 1st, 1866.
Because they're slaves.
No, but slavery's over.
Oh, slavery's over.
Slavery ends in 65.
Oh, okay.
Slavery officially ends in December 65 with the 13th Amendment. But by January 1st, 1866, you haven't begun to get enfranchisement. 14th Amendment is going to be a couple of years later. 15th Amendment is now till 1870. And the Supreme Court in 1915 says that is unconstitutional because they chose January 1st, 1866 to discriminate against black voters. But in the meantime, Oklahoma comes up with another test, and another system of registration, and the Supreme Court doesn't bother to strike that down until the 1930s. So you have a little bit here and there. Another big issue is the primary. I don't think you have primaries in Canada.
No, not the way you do.
Okay, in the United States, primaries are very important. And in the South, from the end of the Civil War to the 1960s, the South is known as the Solid South. It always votes Democratic. This is not the Democratic Party of Lyndon Johnson and the Civil Rights Act. This is the Democratic Party of people like Strom Thurmond, who later becomes a Republican.
George Wallace.
George Wallace, yes. This is George Wallace.
Segregationist Democrats.
These are segregationist Democrats. Yeah. And in most of the South, the only election that matters is the primary.
Right.
Because the Democrat wins. Every single member of the senatorial and House delegations from the South from 1900 to 1960 is a Democrat. So the Democratic Party is what matters. And so what Southern states do in some places is they say, you know, the Democratic Party, that's not an official election. That's just a group of people getting together and having a straw poll. And so they can do whatever they want. So the Democratic Party would say blacks may not be members of the Democratic Party, therefore they can't vote in the primary.
Gotcha.
And that effectively disfranchises blacks, except for federal elections.
Let's go to 51 years ago, as we did off the top. The Civil Rights Act is passed by Lyndon Johnson.
And Congress. I mean, it's...
And Congress, of course.
Johnson pushes it, Congress passes it.
Right. Then, 50 years ago, Martin Luther King, among others, goes to Johnson and says, we need a Voting Rights Act now, because the Civil Rights Act only got half the job done. And LBJ's advisors are telling him, don't do this. Don't do the Voting Rights Act so soon on the heels of the Civil Rights Act. How come?
Well, because the fear is that it will cost the party the election. And of course, in fact, in '68, Nixon will defeat Humphrey, who was Johnson's vice president. There are a lot of reasons for that. Vietnam is one of them. But Johnson understands that in 1965, he has an impregnable Democratic majority. in both houses, and he understands that this is the time to do it. You know, he's a Southerner. He understands what the South does, and Lyndon Johnson has a very long history of being more progressive than almost any other Southern politician on race. In 1954, the Supreme Court declares segregated schools unconstitutional. Every Southern senator except the two from Tennessee, Al Gore Sr. is one of them, Al Gore Jr.'s father, and Estes Kefauver, who had run for vice president under Stevenson, would run for vice president with Stevenson in '56. And Lyndon Johnson are the only Southern senators that don't sign what's called the Southern Manifesto. So Johnson has a long record of understanding the need for civil rights, and he understands that political power is everything. By the way, when he signs the bill, he says to somebody, this is going to destroy the Democratic Party in the South.
He was right about that.
Well, it doesn't destroy it, it changes it. So instead of being the party of white supremacy and bigotry, it has become the party of a small number of white liberals and African Americans and Hispanics. And you see this in elections today. For example, the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, is black. It is a white majority city. But you now have enough black voters plus enough moderate white voters to elect the best person. Mayor of Dallas was black a few years ago. So you're beginning to see some changes, but it's 50 years after the Voting Rights Act that we're beginning to see this.
Well, let's see how this Voting Rights Act got passed. Because again, you know, for those who didn't live through it, but who may have seen the movie Selma, which came out last year, let's take you back to the time. January '65, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. leads a civil rights march on Selma. A month later, Malcolm X gives a barn burner of a speech saying that Dr. King's nonviolent approach is not working and we got to do something harder. Then in March, King leads the Selma to Montgomery marches. There's a lot of tension with the White House about the advisability of doing these marches. People are getting beaten up and killed during these marches. John Lewis, who's still a congressman to this day, participates in those marches over the Pettus Bridge. What impact did all of that have in getting LBJ to eventually change his mind, overrule his advisors, and say, we do need to introduce a Voting Rights Act and get it passed now?
Well, I'm not sure that he changes his mind. In other words, it seems to me that this is what Johnson wants to do, and it's a matter of timing and when he does it.
Okay.
But what
The movie certainly suggests that he changes his mind.
You know, you shouldn't go to the movies to learn history. You should go to the movies to be entertained. And if you learn something along the way that's useful and historical, all the better. But this is about selling tickets at the box office, and a movie has to have a villain. And rather than making the villain who it should have been, which would have been the governor of Alabama, the governor of Mississippi, rather than making the villains the white power structure of the South, they turn Lyndon Johnson, I think, deeply and unfairly into being a villain in this movie.
And that was mentioned actually last year at the time when this came out.
Yeah, and every historian who has commented on this movie, even if they don't like Lyndon Johnson, say that this movie is deeply unfair to Lyndon Johnson. So that's the problem with learning your history from movies.
Okay, fair enough.
But
having said all that,
what the marches do, and they do it really even earlier than this, what the marches and the protests do is they bring into the living room of every American what exactly segregation and racism really is.
because it covered this stuff live on TV.
Yeah. Look, I grew up in way upstate New York, 20 miles from the Canadian border at the Thousand Islands Bridge. There were maybe 24 black people in my town. I always said that blacks weren't crazy enough to move up where it was that cold, but that's not true. It's just that there weren't very many black people in my town. And most of the people in my town had no idea what segregation was. We watched it on TV. We watched the people hosing down children in Birmingham. We watched people being beaten with sticks. And by the way, the southern states did everything they could to prevent the national media from covering this. This is a free press story and a free speech story. The Southern officials sue the New York Times. Eventually the Supreme Court throws the suits out in 1964 in a case called New York Times versus Sullivan. But at the time, there were about $11.5 million of judgments against the New York Times, which in the 1960s would have put the newspaper out of business. And they were suing them for libel for saying things about Southern politicians and police that happened mostly to be true, but if there was one factual error, they'd win a libel judgment. So the civil rights movement is also about a free press and free speech.
Very fast lesson in here in how bills get passed in your country. The Senate passes a version of it, the House passes a version of it, they come together in a conference, they agree on a compromise, and then they send it to the president for signature. Here are the numbers I want to put to you. May of '65, the Senate passes this bill 77-19, most of the opposition coming from Democrats.
Southern Democrats, though.
Yes.
These are white Southern.
Okay. Hold on for it.
Okay,
More to come.
Yeah.
July of '65, the House of Representatives passes their version, and it passes 333 to 85, and again, almost all the opposition coming from Democrats. I say this because today, the Democratic Party obviously is the party that 90% of American blacks vote for.
That's right.
And, obviously back then, not the case.
No.
What is going on here?
No. At that time, most blacks are also voting Democratic.
In the South?
They're not voting in the South.
They're not voting in the South.
The
Right.
40% of the blacks that are voting in the North are voting for Democrats.
Right.
The office holders, by this time, by this time there are 6 blacks in the U.S. House of Representatives, all from the North. They are Democrats. What happens, the political history is this. In the Civil War, the Republican Party is the party of liberty, it's the anti-slavery party. The Democratic Party is the party of the Confederacy, it's the party of racism. In the period after the Civil War, the Republicans remain the party of Lincoln, and blacks vote Republican where they can vote from 1866 or 67 on, up through the 1930s. All right, and the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln, and in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, a fair number of blacks are elected to Congress. They are all Republicans. The last black leaves the House of Representatives in 1901. He had been reelected. He'd been elected in 1898. His term ended in 1901, and he's gone. And the next black that comes in will be a black from Chicago who's a Republican in the 1920s. But by the 1930s, under Franklin Roosevelt, blacks have moved into the Democratic Party in the North, in part because Republicans are no longer happy about having blacks in their party. And in the South, blacks are mixed. Where they can vote, they tend to vote Republican, but they gradually move to being, again, supporting Roosevelt.
So let's figure this out here. After the Voting Rights Act, then, in August of '65, is passed by the Congress, sent to the president, LBJ signs it, what actually changed?
Well, what actually changes is not very much very quickly. That is, what really changes is for the first time, the federal government is now going to take over the process of registering voters. And so Oprah Winfrey, in the clip we just saw, is going to get to register to vote. The Voting Rights Act bans these literacy tests. It bans all of these tests. By the way, the country had also just passed a constitutional amendment banning poll taxes in federal elections. So, because that was another way you would make people pay a tax in order to vote. So you begin to get black voter registration in the South, and you begin to get a small number of blacks being elected to local offices. But throughout the South, especially the Deep South, there is tremendous resistance on the part of the white power structure. And so the South goes into phase 2 of fighting it, which is redistricting. They stop having districts so that for city council, all city councils members will be elected at large. So that means if you have a city that's 40% black and a coherent black community, if all the councilmen are elected at large, the 60% of the whites can elect all the at-large delegates, and the 40% of the blacks can't elect anybody.
Assuming whites vote for whites and blacks vote for blacks.
And that, of course, is almost universally happening, not entirely. There is one very short moment when Andrew Young, who is an early civil rights worker, is elected from a white majority district in Atlanta, but it's a very kind of liberal, economically upscale, highly educated white population along with blacks. But other than that, it's all segregated. Let me give you quick numbers, okay? 1969, 4 years after the Voting Rights Act, Congressman Clay is elected from St. Louis. He is the first black elected from a former slave state since 1898. In 1971, a black, Perrin Mitchell, is elected from Baltimore. Maryland was also one of the last slave states. So you have 2 blacks in Congress starting in 1971. But by this time, there are 13 blacks in Congress from the North. In 1981, 10 years later, there are 4 Southern blacks in Congress. That's all there are. But in 1985, there are 5 Southern blacks, but there are 15 Northern blacks. And it's not until 1993 that you get black congressmen from Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, Virginia.
Because you had a black president then.
1993.
Bill Clinton.
Yeah, well.
First black president.
Well, you could say that. And 1991 is the first black elected. By the way, the years I'm giving is when they take office. They're elected. They're elected November 1990. They take office in 91. So first Louisiana black comes in 91. But even to this day, there are only 47 members of the House of Representatives who are black, which is about 10%.
And I think they're all Democrats, aren't they?
There is one.
There might be one Republican?
There is one black senator, oddly enough, from South Carolina. He's a Tea Party black.
Right.
Tim Scott.
Tim Scott,
He's the anomaly. There have been the occasional black conservatives elected from various places.
Let's finish up on this in our last 30 seconds here. The U.S. Justice Department says that the Voting Rights Act that we've been talking about, celebrating its 50th anniversary, is the most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever enacted in America. Do you agree with that?
After the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery.
After the, well, okay, good point.
Or after the 13th and 14th Amendment, or after the Civil Rights Act of 1866. I would simply, being someone who's concerned about history, I would say that it is the most effective Civil Rights Act passed since 1900. And that's an awfully long time. And it is central to changing America. One of the differences, which is where you started, between Canada and the U.S., is that there is no attempt, as far as I can see watching Canadian elections, to have voter suppression. Canada doesn't want to prevent people from voting. Australia requires that you vote.
Yes.
In the United States, we have massive voter suppression. The most recently, Alabama has passed a voter ID law, and at the same time, the governor has shut down about 20 driver's license offices in 20 counties. So in about 20 counties, there are no driver's license offices. These are black majority counties. So you can't get your voter ID, but you need it to vote.
So there are still, 50 years later, attempts to disenfranchise blacks in the United
South Carolina is 29% black, 15% of the state Senate is black. Do the numbers.
Paul, it's always good of you to visit us here at TVO. We appreciate your contribution to this issue very much.
I love coming here, and I'll come back from Saskatoon if you'd like.
Terrific. Paul Finkelman, visiting professor of human rights law, University of Saskatchewan College of Law.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.